Hey everyone! So, my book is Evicted Poverty and Profit in the American City. And this book is written by Matthew Desmond, who is currently a sociologist and a professor at Harvard University. And Desmond became interested in the area of poverty because after his parents lost their home to foreclosure when he was in college, he felt like this incessant need to understand poverty in America. And so he did that. And what he found was that the discourse around poverty would talk about poor people as though they lived in isolation or lived in some other America. They would speak of the livelihoods of the rich and the middle class as being intertwined, but would neglect the poor when it came to conversations connecting all of them. And so he wanted to know why the lives of the rich and the poor are not connected, right? So Desmond states that poverty is a relationship involving the rich and the poor. And this relationship is, excuse me, and to understand poverty, we need to understand this relationship. So he wanted to find a process that would bound these two groups, and these two groups together in mutual dependence and struggle. And he found that eviction is this process, and they're bounded by two ways. One, you could say proximity, right? When it comes to the eviction process, it brings together tenants, families, landlords, social workers, lawyers, judges, sheriffs. Groups from different two groups from that have a disparity in power. Excuse me, and also to exploitation, right? The rich exploit the poor. That is why they're in. That's why they're in the position that they are in. Um, so Desmond spent 10 months in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, United States of America, in two impoverished areas. Um, a trailer park with mostly white residents, with a white landlord, and an apartment building, apartment house, largely African American population with an African American landlord. And so basically, what he did was he immersed himself in the lives of these six families and their landlords. And he observed and recorded as much as he could. He would, especially with the tenants, he would eat dinner with them, go to eviction hearings with them, would play cards with them. Any time that he could spend with these individuals, he would. Um, so, what makes this book really unique, I find, is that these individuals in these book dedicate, live within the private market rental sector. There is this assumption that if you're poor, you're probably living in some form of public housing, or you're relying on the government for some subsidies. But the reality is that most poor people live in the private rental sector. And actually, he has a stat here. 67% of poor renting families received no federal assistance for housing at all. And actually, currently in Milwaukee, the rental assistance program is frozen, and there is a long waiting list for public housing. So I think this captures an accurate portrayal of poverty. Even most research that focuses on poverty focus on people living in public housing. They are the minority when it comes to this. Also, it's important to note that these individuals in this book dedicate a large portion of their household income towards rent. Most dedicate about 70 to 80% of their income. So, why is there a rise in evictions? Reduction in public housing, of course, and housing assistance, the rising costs of hydro and electricity, and the growing gap between private market housing prices and income for low income households. So, Desmond states that poverty is and evictions are lucrative. Value is being extracted from poor neighborhoods and poor households. Actually, the two landlords in this book They are part of the top 1% of income earners, and yet their tenants belong to the bottom 10%. And so these people are gaining from their tenants' impending economic homelessness. Uh, and even there's business surrounded, uh, there's business models based on evictions. Like, for example, like pawn shops, money marts. Uh, Another thing is businesses that deal with money judgments. So when someone doesn't pay their rent, of course, they're going to have a money judgment and they're going to have that paper trail that they didn't pay their rent. And so that stops them from property purchases, and it damages their credit. And so there's a business, the rent recovery service, a debt collection service where it claims to get tenants back on their feet, of course, with a high interest loan, right? And then even a lot of the tenants, when they are evicted, landlords will have moving and storage companies come in and basically take out their stuff. And one of the main ones is called the Eagle and Moving Storage, and evictions made up 40% of their business in Milwaukee. So it's important that we acknowledge that race intersects with poverty. And evictions, yes, they do afflict the poor, but they disproportionately affect Black women. Women from Black neighborhoods made up 9% of Milwaukee's population and 30% of its evicted tenants. Another statistic is that in Milwaukee, over 1 in 5 Black women report having been evicted in their adult life. 1 in 5, compared to 1 in 12 Hispanic women and 1 in 15 white women. So Desmond says that if incarceration had come to define the lives of men from impoverished Black neighborhoods, evictions were shaping the lives of Black women. Poor Black men were being locked up, and poor Black women were locked out. And I like that he's kind of creating this connection between the housing sector and the criminal justice sector. I wonder, I also think, like, will this change the discourse surrounding evictions? Will this be seen as a criminal justice issue? Will this maybe further create urgency in dealing with these impending evictions? It's also important to acknowledge or to give historical context as to why African American people are disproportionately affected by evictions. Going back to the Great Migration in 1915, when many African American people from the rural South moved to places like Chicago, Philadelphia, Milwaukee, when they arrived at the cities, they were crowded in these like small apartments, and landlords exploited them, knowing that they didn't have the options to go anywhere else. And and so and also too, as going like African Americans, I can't remember the date, but African Americans were excluded from mortgages as well and home ownership. And even when they were given the ability to get a mortgage, again, they were exploited, and they were targeted by these subprime lending industries, and they were being lured into buying bad mortgages. And then it comes in the housing discrimination. And so this Black rental class is socially constructed, and I think that's important to keep in mind. So one of the things that Desmond proposes is having to ending the eviction crisis is having a universal housing voucher. Now, this voucher would anyone would be entitled to this voucher. If your rent or your utilities exceeded 30% of your household income, the government would come in and subsidize the rest, and that subsidy would be transferred directly to the landlord, and all landlords would be required to participate, and anyone could participate in this housing voucher. I don't know. It's funny. When I saw this when I when I read this housing voucher, I was just like, what utopian society is Desmond living in? I I don't see it as being feasible. But he believes that, as he quote, just to quote him, he says, this would change the face of poverty. Evictions would plummet. Homelessness would almost disappear. Low income tenants would have more income to spend on other expenses, and low income individuals and families would have more stability. And yes, I do agree with that notion that the universal housing voucher can save a lot of people from impending homelessness or evictions. But I just don't see it as being feasible under the Trump regime. Like, see, yeah, is it tangible, right? And actually, a week and a half ago or 2 weeks ago, Trump came out with his proposed budget. And you learn that he is going to reduce the housing, excuse me, the US Department of Housing and Urban Development by 13%. So I think he's decreasing it by $6 billion. And this is a department that owns and maintains public housing complexes and provides vouchers for low income people that live in private housing and gives out grants that helps nonprofits invest in parks and apartment buildings. And he even cut, was it 30% of Meals on Wheels? So, no, I don't think it's feasible in the United States. But then you have to ask yourself, is it feasible in Canada? Right? Because we already have an established universal healthcare system. So, would we be more open to the idea, the fact that we have a liberal government? I don't know. I will be talking about in class the pros and cons to this, and we can further discuss this. Also, I wonder too, like, Evicted was written 2 years ago. If Evicted was written now, would he be proposing this universal housing voucher? Like, I don't know, I find that interesting. Another thing that Desmond says is that we need a publicly funded legal service for families, and that we need to invest in that because there is a disparity in power between a tenant and a landlord. 90% of landlords have an attorney present, and only 10% of, and sorry, excuse me, and 90% of tenants do not. So, there is in the South Bronx, there there is a legal assistance program, and they took on 1,300 families, and yeah, they were able to prevent evictions by 86%. Yeah, I think this would be perfect, but and I think this is well needed. Also, too, it's important to note that having an eviction record stays on someone's credit report for 10 years. So it just pushes someone further into poverty, right? Because now this person, now their housing is limited, and they may be forced to have to accept substandard housing. Also, too, having an eviction record makes you less likely to be able to get affordable housing. So, yeah. So, this book is innovative in two ways, through language and storytelling. I think Desmond definitely uses innovative language, and this is evident by the way that he defines eviction, right? So eviction for many people, it's just kind of like, oh, okay, it's just you kicked out of your house. It's going to be a phase, it's like a stage, like a transitory period between now and your next home. But for Desmond, eviction is like causes loss. Eviction causes families to lose their home, their school, their neighborhood, their possessions, their furniture, their clothes. It creates psychological instability where people can't invest in their home or social relationships. It stops community stability. It stops you from creating social bonds with your neighbor. It's a precursor of suicide, leads to employment instability, and he goes on, right? Like he's defining eviction in a way that creates empathy, that like elicits, like it creates meaning, right? Because I find that the conversations or especially let's say in the housing sector, right? The discussions of homelessness and housing or are kind of, we're demoted to using like platitudes like housing is a need. And it's like, duh, like we know that as a society, but you're not talking about housing or whatever your organization is, you're not talking about it in a way that speaks to that person's heart. So storytelling. So evicted uses people's lived experiences for social impact. It just does. Reading this book, you're bearing witness to the trauma and that comes with being evicted. And again, he's inviting his readers to kind of create meaning. And he also creates like this really unique narrative by like pairing like vivid, descriptive accounts of these lived experiences, right, with statistical evidence and historical context. If you actually had the opportunity to read the prologue, you would see that you're introduced to Arlene, who is being evicted, and you're like witnessing her going from house to house, right, and the struggle that ensues from that. But then afterwards, he gives you like a historical context. He gives you statistical evidence, right? And I think he's almost, I don't know if it's like, I think it's definitely strategic, right? Because he's like, he almost wants you to put a face to the statistic, but he almost wants to like capture your heart or I don't know, for you to like give a shit. Like that's what his goal is. Uh, and I think you'll be more open to hearing about about the evidence. Yeah, so basically he wants the reader to become invested first before propose. Like even an example too is just the two like the legal reform and the housing reforms that I just mentioned earlier. Sorry, the housing voucher and having legal aid. He didn't introduce those concepts until the very end, and I think he wanted you to become invested first. And also too, like these stories are a resistance against the status quo. Like they're changing society's perception of why and who or what and blah 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 about all these victims. Like they're telling you like this isn't just exclusively for evictions, isn't just a story relegated to a certain group, to a segment of the population. That this is something that this could happen to anybody. um yeah. And it also too, another thing is it makes you question, working within the social service sector. Like you have to ask yourself, like, what is the best way to communicate our message, our nonprofit, in a way that encourages empathy. Now, storytelling is a great tool for social impact, but it can also be problematic. And it's important to acknowledge that like these individuals in this book are not telling their own story. It's Desmond that's playing the role as mediator between the audience and these storytellers. Also, too, he's the one that's picking and choosing the details. So, yeah, that's another concern. Also, these people are not gaining the same healing or validation that they would receive if they were telling their own story. And let's be honest, we're deriving meaning from their pain and their trauma as readers. And but what I do really like though is that even though even though he's capturing their experiences and profiting off this book, let's keep it 100, he created an evicted book foundation where all the proceeds would go to the families in this book. And so at least I don't know how much money he's getting, but I mean, at least money is going towards helping those people because they are suffering from economic homelessness. Or, yeah. Another thing is he created this website called Just Shelter. I would click the link, but I don't know if I'd be able to go back to my presentation. But if you have the opportunity, check it out. And it's a website that connects people with community organizations, that work within the affordable housing, that prevent evictions, and so on. And he also has a section in there in the website where people can tell their own stories. So I think he acknowledged that, like, yeah, I am working as a mediator, and so let me strip myself of that role when it comes to this website, so anybody can go on and tell their stories of them being convicted, and they can. I don't know if they can connect with people, but definitely an opportunity for them to tell their stories. So, who is this book for? Anyone that cares about housing poverty. Um, I think deep down, because of the solutions that Desmond has provided, those could only be done by people of power, in power, excuse me. Like he's asking for some reforms that, these are policymakers, these are government officials, these are people of wealth that could achieve this. So I'm thinking that it's almost as though he wants those people to read this book so that it kind of gives them a reality check as to what is happening, because they're so, like, they're not, like, a lot of these people in power are not even connected with what's happening in life, right? So I think that's what it is too. And if I believe Desmond's take home message is that, eviction is a cause, not just a condition of poverty. Like, it actually pushes people into deeper poverty. And also too, that you have to recognize that you can't fix poverty without fixing housing. I think we're so worried about, I don't know, like, I have to say, okay, so he says that, do we believe that a right to a decent home is part of what it means to be an American? And I wish, like, I would have tailored this question, because I would say, do government officials, the rich, people in public policy, do they believe that the right to a decent home is part of what it means to be an American, or for us Canadians? Because I think it's really the people in power that can really shift this. And I don't know, coming away from this book, I'm feeling less optimistic. Actually, just even doing my placement and working within the housing sector, like, I've realized that the system, this government system, just the system in place is just designed to fail the poor. And I don't know, there's just so many barriers in place, and where I feel like, I don't know, I'm just feeling less optimistic. And if I could just critique one big thing, I wish Desmond would have been more critical of the government role in the exploitation process. The rich are where they are at, and because they have the cosign of the government in place. And so I wish he went into that a little bit more. And that is my presentation. Thank you.